Welcome to the War Insider YouTube channel. You can support our team by subscribing. Vladimir Putin finally sold Russia to China. The dictator put everything on the line in his paranoid and insane plan to capture Ukraine, including Russian territories and the male population of Russia. Russia will not survive a war against Ukraine, as it will bring economic collapse and civil conflict to Moscow. At the same time, Putin has decided to mobilize thousands of Russians to send them to certain death in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Chinese presence in eastern Russia is steadily increasing, and Beijing is strengthening its influence there. Putin has secured the support of China to avoid an inevitable defeat in the war. However, China is far from a benefactor and certainly not a fan of the Kremlin. Russia will disintegrate into separate republics. Beijing is pursuing a cunning and balanced policy. Xi Jinping took advantage of Putin's fragile position to gain geopolitical and strategic historical advantages from the war he initiated. China will take Russia's most valuable asset, the eastern regions, along with their natural resources. Thus, the war currently determines which part of Russia will survive and enter the future Russia exclusively its European part, up to the Urals. Analysts believe that the Russian Federation will disintegrate into separate republics. China will be able to take control of the republics in eastern Russia. The scenario is not new. This is exactly how Moscow used puppet republics in Donbass, the DPR and LPR. And now the Chinese will take under their protectorate the regions in the Russian Far East that want to exist separately from Moscow. The difference is only that in this case, the republics will be real. They will not need to be artificially created. After all, these regions of Russia really want to separate from Moscow and use their natural resources for development, not for the enrichment of the leadership of Gazprom. In addition, they definitely do not want to send their soldiers to die for Putin's manic and paranoid desires. Mobilized Russians will die for the interests of China. Initiatives for the independence of regions in modern Russia are already actively promoted by dissidents. For example, one of the goals of the Post-Russia Free Nations Forum is to declare independence for indigenous peoples and regions of Russia. This process will include deimperialization, decolonization, demilitarization, and denuclearization of modern Russian state. The ultimate goal of dissidents in Russia is the disintegration of the empire, which is currently waging an aggressive war against Ukraine. From a European perspective, the disintegration of Russia is much less dangerous than its continuation under the rule of criminals, according to Polish MEP Anna Fotyga. Additionally, there is a friendly China nearby that will not hesitate to use its military force to ensure security in the eastern regions of Russia, where many ethnic Chinese reside, during inevitable turmoil in Russia. As a result, mobilized Russians will die in Ukraine for the interests of China. Why Putin sold Russia to China? Shortly before the invasion of Ukraine, Putin traveled to Beijing for the Winter Olympics to announce his all-encompassing friendship with Xi Jinping. However, it is clear who is the superpower in this duo today. As Russia is experiencing rapid economic decline due to sanctions and oil embargoes, China remains the only potential savior for Putin. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine deprived the Kremlin of almost all its allies and forced it to accept dependence on Xi Jinping. China's economy, which is worth $18 trillion, is more than 10 times larger than Russia's. Beijing has better cards in its relations with Russia in any situation on the world chessboard. China is playing its own geopolitical and economic game. There have been reports in the media that China is supplying Russia with components for weapons, which are then broken down into repair kits. In reality, China continues to use Russia as a lever of influence on Europe and the United States. However, the Chinese-Russian partnership has limitations. China is trying not to provide direct material support to Russia in order to avoid being subject to Western sanctions. The sale of oil and gas to Europe has been one of the main sources of currency inflows for Russia ever since Soviet geologists discovered oil and gas in the swamps of Siberia. Now, China has become the biggest buyer of Russian oil and gas, the largest consumer of energy resources in the world. China's purchases of oil, liquefied natural gas, coal, and electricity from Russia have grown rapidly. Restrictions and benefits for China in borderless relations with Russia. Xi Jinping shares Putin's hostility towards the West and NATO, but that does not mean that the Chinese leader will help Moscow without his own benefits. Xi's top strategic task is the prosperity and security of China, not the rescue of Russia, which is approaching economic collapse due to the war with Ukraine. Beijing buys some of the oil that was previously exported to Europe, but at a huge discount. China will only help Russia to the extent that it does not risk being subject to sanctions and does not jeopardize its trade agreements with the US and EU. The declared boundless friendship between Moscow and Beijing has significant limitations. At the same time, what should be more concerning for Russians is that China has increased the price for its support. The point is that Beijing demands territory with resources. Otherwise, what can be taken from an impoverished outcast state that desperately tries to get at least some support? Experts say. Under these conditions, Russia faces one of two scenarios: either disintegration into independent republics or a coup and the removal of Putin. Either way, Russians face a civil conflict, and in both cases, China will benefit, as it already has a promise from official Moscow. What does this mean for Russians? Russians should seriously think about their future and decide what will remain of Russia after the collapse of the state or de facto annexation of the eastern territories by China. Since Russia will soon no longer have the funds for information operations and disinformation campaigns in the West, the lives of agents of influence will become problematic. Already, some of them are transitioning from pro-Moscow rhetoric to pro-Chinese, feeling the real geopolitical power and inevitability of Moscow's collapse. This is all for today. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button if you enjoyed the video. We'll be back with more updates and information. Thanks for watching.